Hello, and welcome to Making Creativity Pay, the podcast where we talk to people in creative industries about how they promote and market their work. I'm Dan Barnett, and on this episode I speak to Rosie Wilby about her experiences in the creative sector. Rosie's experiences cover a range of areas we talked to others about before, but all in a single person, as her background includes music and comedy, as well as being an author and podcaster. I started by asking Rosie to give a brief introduction to herself.
Hello, I'm Rosie Wilby and I am a comedian, podcaster and author, and I am nicknamed the Queen of Breakups because of my work on the book and podcast The Breakup Monologues, where a lot of comedians, authors and fellow creative people have shared their sometimes hilarious, sometimes very poignant and touching stories of heartbreak and recovery.
Yes, so one thing you didn't mention there, you had a career in music as well before that. You've got many strings to your bow.
I do. That's very true. So for many years before I turned to comedy, I was working as a musician, as a singer-songwriter, very much around the sort of, very, very tail end of the 90s when I was still in my 20s and still a young musician, a young indie chick, but mostly sort of in the very early noughties as well. I was touring around and I released an album on my own label. It was very much at that time when it just started to be something that artists were doing, was sort of taking control of their own careers. It was the very, very early days of this thing called the internet. And everyone had very long and clunky web addresses in those days. My first website for my band was a freeserve.co.uk URL. And we all had long and clunky web addresses and got excited when we got an email. And it's bizarre to think of now. But yeah, it was, I suppose, this exciting idea that this new portal had been opened up where artists could potentially bypass the traditional gatekeepers of record labels or publishers or those people who decide what creative work has merit and doesn't, what should reach a wider audience and be marketed and promoted or shouldn't. So it seemed like there was this sort of anarchic way of shaking things up. I mean, of course, what we've seen is the internet just become just as corporate a marketplace as any television channel or radio station or, all the billboards in the, Piccadilly Circus in London and so on. So everything is commercialized to within an inch of its life wherever you go, whether that's in the real world or online. But I suppose there was this sense that you could take some kind of control over your career. And so, I set up my own record label and did release an album that you can still hear on Spotify. And I used to go under my surname, Wilby, which was really me and my songs and a sort of rotating cast of musicians. And we did some really fun gigs, mostly around London, but a little bit around all over the UK and internationally as well. And it was fun times, although I guess the interesting thing about music versus comedy in terms of money is if you are someone who plays with a band, that's a lot of people to split the money around. If you get a couple of £100 for a gig, if it's just you doing a stand-up gig, you might think, oh, that's nice. Whereas if there are 5 of you, suddenly it's £40 each. And so, you don't often get paid more because there's more of you. So that was definitely something to think about when I was playing in a band. And I loved having that community and that family around me. But if you are a sort of gigging, jobbing band or musician, you really are talking about often just rocking up to a small venue, a pub gig or something and earning those kind of amounts. So it makes a huge, huge difference if you've got to circulate it between a number of people. One thing that was exciting though was in those days was when my music started getting played on the radio and I started earning royalties from it, and you would every 6 months or so get your PRS statement with your earnings on, and occasionally you'd get a really great one, and you'd earn like $1,000 or something. You'd be like, oh my God, I'm absolutely loaded, because it's all relative, isn't it? Compared to, getting £50 cash for playing a few acoustic songs, or whatever. Yeah, it was definitely interesting times, and it's definitely quite interesting to see the differences between music and comedy. And also on the music circuit in the sort of late 90s and early noughties in London, you couldn't play too many gigs close together, because the onus was really placed on musicians and bands to promote themselves and bring your crowd to the gig. And basically, you're sort of selling tickets yourself, a bit like a comedian would do at the Edinburgh Fringe. But largely speaking, comedy doesn't work quite like that when you're sort of gigging on the circuit more broadly. And largely speaking, comedy promoters actually promote and try and get an audience. And a lot of the very good clubs, of course, have a very regular and very loyal and dedicated audience that always come along. So it wouldn't be on the comedian themselves to bring their crowd along, which means that as a comedian, you can gig every night, or even do 2 or 3 gigs in one night and dash about between different venues. At Edinburgh Fringe, you might even do 5, 6, 7 gigs in the same day. Whereas for me as a musician, it took me a while to get my head around that, because you would often sign contracts with, independent promoters that ran gigs at little venues like the Hope and Anchor in Islington. I used to live on the street with that pub at the end, and we did lots of gigs there. But you would often have to sign a contract saying you wouldn't gig several weeks either side in London. So it kind of limited how frequently you could perform. But obviously, as a band, you would definitely spend a lot of time rehearsing. But then that's an extra cost, isn't it? You're probably hiring a rehearsal room. Maybe you're hiring backline equipment, hiring a drum kit. Maybe if your drummer doesn't want to bring their whole kit along. So, yeah, it was definitely in many ways even hard. I mean, it's difficult to earn money through comedy and now writing, which is the main thing that I do. But music was really tough. And, that's even with it wasn't just that I was shit, I'd like to point out. I was getting great reviews in The Guardian, and I played Ronnie Scott's and Glastonbury and loads of great festivals and venues, and supported some big artists on tour and that kind of thing. And so, and I did have some nice songs that people really loved.
You kind of talked quite a bit in the past tense there. So, I mean, is music just kind of not on your radar now, or do you kind of dabble now and again? Because one of our previous guests was Lexi Strum. I think she had about 20 years between, probably similar-ish time to you, when she had an album out but it never got released, and then she kind of put it out last year. But I think it kind of the music industry was quite brutal to her. But she came back, and she's had that desire to kind of come back and everything. I mean, is it something that every now and again you revisit?
Not so much for me, because I just think there's a very different emotion and part of my life attached to music. It was very much a conscious shift into comedy, because towards the end of my music career, as it turned out, I mean, it wasn't a conscious ending. It was more of a drifting into comedy, and things just switched. But it was a very volatile time in my personal life. I lost my mum. My first serious relationship broke up. I was coming to the end of my 20s, which we always see as a big turning point, turning 30. And also, girlfriend and I, who then became my ex, we had a house fire at our house where we lost loads of our stuff. I mean, fortunately, we did have contents insurance, and the sort of dark joke I can make now is that we did get our deposit back, because our terrible landlord had furnished the flat with highly flammable furniture, which had certainly not helped matters. It basically created a bonfire. So yeah, we got our deposit back with no questions asked. But yeah, I remember all my friends at the time, because I had my album launch gig coming up, and all my friends sort of searching down the backs of their wardrobes for old clothes that me and Donna could borrow. And one friend even gave me her brownie uniform. She popped that in there. I don't know when I was going to wear
that. So you're saying that you kind of then moved on to comedy. So it's not so much you're thinking you're leaving your 20s, settle down, be sensible, do a inverted commas proper job. You thought, no, I want to be a comedian now.
Well, I'd had so much heaviness in my life, with my mum getting ill and with the big breakup. And that's such a destabilizing thing when the first really serious relationship that you enter and the first really fun, loving partnership, particularly when you're gay at that time, when that isn't always very accepted, and when you're with someone who, is like you, kind of feels okay in themselves about that identity, and you're sort of taking on the world together. So there was something very comforting about that relationship. So what I would say is we did always stay friends, which is an incredibly valuable thing for me to hold on to that part of that piece of my life. But I think that it was important to sort of find an escape from some of those difficult and painful experiences and find some levity and some humor. As it turns out, I've ultimately used comedy to explore some slightly darker, more challenging issues, as many comedians do, as we know. But I think initially the appeal was to actually escape a little bit and sort of become a sort of slightly more constructed comedy persona. Even though I've never been a character act, you are sort of putting on some kind of a defense with humor, aren't you? And it's that balance of finding something that's not so removed from yourself that you are hiding behind it, but it's also something that keeps you a little bit safe.
And so, obviously, a lot of the stuff you do now around breakup monologues and stuff like that is very much about kind of love and relationships. Was that always the kind of starting point for your comedy?
Yeah, very much so. I think love and relationships really interests me, because, yeah, partly because I mentioned I'm a gay woman, and my outsider point of view on that, I think, made me want to understand my own narrative, understand why I feel the way I do, because it was so disapproved of when I was at school. I mean, actually, the Tories are potentially bringing in something, policies with echoes of Section 28, which was in play when me and many of my peers were at school, which meant that teachers couldn't talk about homosexuality. And so this was hugely damaging for many young people, because it felt like this horrible, shameful thing. Or indeed, if your classmates said homophobic things in lessons that they'd maybe heard, on the TV, or heard their parents saying, or whatever, then teachers wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. And so homophobia was allowed free reign, really, at school, and kind of 80s and 90s and noughties. So yeah, I was really interested in finding more celebratory narrative and looking at the non-mainstream narratives. And really, for any of us, if you're gay, straight, bi, however you fit on any of those spectrums, pansexual, really, we do need to do away with some of the myths about how romantic love works, and how, it's all supposed to be like it is in the movies, and you meet one person and they fulfill your every need, and then you just sort of drive off into the sunset together, and you're happy forever, and you never have an argument or have any problems. And we are sold this ridiculous fairy tale, which is so unrealistic. We think we're going to suddenly know when we meet the right person, and then everything just works out. Of course, we know it's not true, and so we get very confused when it doesn't work like that. And I really wanted to present a really accessible way into that, without my audiences necessarily needing to go away and read a very dry and academic textbook about the psychology of love and how the brain works when we're in love. But what I wanted to do was for me to go and read some of those academic texts and then break that down into something that could be really fun, so we could all start understanding ourselves better, and we could present that narrative from a more inclusive perspective that, sometimes looked from a feminist perspective and didn't look, in this sort of male sort of gaze at everything, sexual, and also obviously inclusive of queerness and different sort of cultural perspectives. We have a very, very Western view on things like monogamy. So I wanted this sort of broader sweep across relationships that I felt would be more helpful to people like me and my friends, and then hopefully audiences beyond that. And yeah, I just thought it was this accessible topic that we all want to know more about and want to understand more about. So it really began with what was the first of a trilogy of shows. I did a show called The Science of Sex, which was like a spoofy, subversive sex ed lesson, the one we'd all wished we'd had at school. And then the middle part of the trilogy that followed that was a show called Is Monogamy Dead, based on a survey about what counts as cheating, which became my first book. And then the final part of that was a show all about breakups, which eventually sort of spun off into the Breakup Monologues podcast and the Breakup Monologues book, which I'm really chuffed to hear that you've been reading, actually.
Yes, enjoyed it. We'll talk about a bit of that now, and then we'll kind of switch back. I was interested in reading the book. I almost, before I read it, I kind of expected it to be a lot more taken from the podcast itself. So almost like a kind of best of in print form. But it's much more about your general experiences and kind of your, like you said, the stuff you've read and your kind of understanding of things with sprinklings of the podcast. Did you ever think of just doing it as like almost a kind of, a best of where you cut and paste and curate the podcast into a written form?
Well, no, I did not, because, and this relates to money and the theme of this podcast, it needed, for my purposes, it needed to be a separate product, a completely separate product that people can enjoy completely separately to the podcast. Podcasting is a wonderful industry, but many of us, as you know, Dan, have this huge conundrum because podcasts are available to listeners free, which is great because it means we can all listen to stuff. But then the majority of podcasters, unless we're sort of sponsored by big companies, and there are all kinds of problems associated with that and what we can say or can't say, we have this problem about how we're going to make money to support our creativity, to support doing it. And so really for me, one way, apart from selling live tickets at live recordings, which is another thing that I've done a lot of, although the pandemic obviously put that on hold for quite some time. But the book was really a plan for me to be able to sell copies of that and also get an advance from a publisher, which we can talk more about. And that would sort of help me continue to create the podcast. I do pay an editor. They're a really lovely friend of mine, so they do sort of charge mates rates, which I'm incredibly grateful for. But there are little costs involved. They're not always huge, but the hosting and all of those things, kind of adds up. So, and also your own time, it's nice to think that you might sometimes be able to reward yourself. So the book was really my way of thinking, how do I make the Breakup Monologues of a product that I can actually, earn a little bit of money from myself, because you can't really earn money from doing a podcast, generally speaking. I know there are some people who do, but most of us are not earning money from our podcasts. We're doing it because we love it. We're getting messages out there that we want to explore and questions that we want to explore. We're engaging with listeners and we love it. So yeah, I wanted to make it a completely different product, basically with a story that I hope pulls you in and you want to follow from the beginning to the end, unlike the episodic nature of a podcast where you would just maybe listen to one because you like the sound of the guest who's on that week. Yeah, it really takes little sprinklings of the podcast, but it goes much, much deeper into the science and psychology of love and heartbreak in a very sort of immersive and, I hope, entertaining way. For example, when I talk about the science of sexuality, you actually go with me on an adventure inside the sex lab, and you're sitting there with me watching erotica whilst I'm being measured, my genital arousal and my pupil dilation and all of these things are being measured. So hopefully that gives people a really, really accessible and funny way into thinking about the psychology of love. I was actually presenting at a conference in front of a load of sex and relationship therapists at the weekend. And I thought, right, I'm going to go for it and I'm going to read this chapter about being in the sex lab. And they were absolutely in hysterics. It was brilliant to make a room full of quite serious academics who had largely been having quite clinical presentations, really just all sort of giggle about sex and it getting discussed in a franco way. And most of them were just like, thank you so much for such a refreshing session. Because we have to talk about sex. We're so coy about it. And so, yeah, it was very important to me that it was a different product because as well as the hardback and the paperback and the Kindle versions, there is an audiobook version, and it would be pointless if that was just a duplicate of a load of the podcast episodes.
Going back to the Fringe, because quite a lot of people I've spoken to on the podcast talk about their Fringe experiences and so on. Like you said, you did 3 consecutive years with your shows.
Yeah, well, it's sort of a bit more complicated than that because that trilogy of shows, I kind of repeated. The Science of Sex got reworked into the Further Science of Sex. So that was 1 year because I got a better venue. And so I went back with it. And also in between those shows, I also did a multimedia feminist adventure show called 90s Woman, which was a really, really fun show. And I'm trying to think if I did any other show. Yeah, I can't quite remember. So I sort of did more years there than I know, early on in my career, there was a year where I just went up and did a split, one of those shows where 3 of you each do 20 minutes. So I've done that kind of Fringe run as well. I was in a play once. So I've done different things up at the Fringe. And I certainly feel like, in fact, my very, very first show there was in 2006 and it was called Olympic Swing Ball Champion 2012. And I was campaigning for swing ball to be made an Olympic sport. And really, it was just a bit of a hook into a very nostalgic show about childhood and about being an only child who entertained herself by playing swing ball in the back garden.
Has it been a few years now since you've taken a show to the Fringe? Is that financial or just that you're busy with 100 other things?
Well, it's partly because I've drifted more towards the literary and publishing and podcasting world and audio. I do a lot of journalism for magazines as well. I still enjoy doing stand-up, but I'm not doing it every night like I used to. I'm not sort of getting on late night trains back from far-flung gigs all over the country all the time anymore. So, yeah, there has been this shift, but I think that was largely down to the pandemic that sort of moved me slightly away from a full-on comedy career into this slightly more portfolio career of writing books, journalism, podcasting, radio presenting. But yeah, the Edinburgh Fringe, I mean, if people read the book, there is a chapter where I literally talk about breaking up with the Edinburgh Fringe. I talk about breakups in a broader sense as well as just, the time I got dumped by email. It felt much better once I'd corrected her spelling. It's not just those romantic breakups, it's friendship breakups, it's professional breakups, and it's these more abstract endings with toxic situations in your life. And Edinburgh Fringe was this really, really distressing month every year for me because really of the money. Also, you can't help comparing how you're doing with other people. How many stars did they get on their posters? How many reviews has that person had? And yeah, I do think there's a load of sort of toxic discrimination, I suppose, really, that is invisible about who is able and allowed to thrive at Edinburgh Fringe, who's got the budget to pay a publicist and pay a producer and pay all these people who can support them and help them to have a smoother time when we're really all up against it, aren't we? Trying to get an audience, trying to work out why the microphones in your venue don't work, why the person who does the show before you always leaves the room in an absolute state and there's rubbish everywhere because maybe they've been throwing things at the audience. And yeah, Edinburgh can be an absolute nightmare. It's basically going for a month to work in way worse conditions than you ever would accept anywhere else. You'd think someone was having a laugh and you go and lose thousands of pounds for doing it instead of getting paid money, which you normally would get. And it's like, I've still not got my head around, why are we doing this to ourselves? It's self-harm. I mean, what is happening? And so I just, when I last went in 2017, I just thought, what is this? Why are we doing this? And so I made a decision not to go anymore. I mean, I then regretted it a little bit when was it 2021 that there was a Fringe that was just really lovely. It was kind of the first one, or was it 22? Probably 21, I guess.
I think it's 2021, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a mini
And
Fringe.
it was just like the old days of, not that many shows, not so many competing artists, and the whole thing wasn't as saturated as it's become. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how you control it. I don't know how you don't want to limit how many people can go and present a show. The idea is it's an open access Fringe, but there's no equal platform, is there? It's, like I mentioned, sort of the internet being commercialized to within an inch of its life. I mean, that's how every square inch of Edinburgh has become during August. And obviously there's a lot more said about it now, but I was really stressed and upset about how much I was having to pay for accommodation, because it was really more than at that time I could afford. And then you're sort of thinking about, how can I afford to eat? And you just shouldn't be worrying about those things when you're trying to perform every day and trying to promote your show, keeping an eye out for whether you've got reviewers in and looking out for any press that's run and using quotes on your flyers, and all of these things that you've got to think about. You're doing other spots running around town trying to promote the show and tell people about it. And of course, many, many people just have really, really small audiences, and they could be brilliant comedians with brilliant shows. And yeah, I just find I find it really difficult to come to terms with how unfair the Fringe is, because money and privilege are such huge, huge factors in how successful you can be there.
So you moved from that into podcasting. I mean, was it a light bulb moment that you thought, I want to have a podcast, I've got something to say? Or was it I'll try podcasting, see how it goes?
Well, everything with me has been a fairly natural and organic evolution. When I moved from music to comedy, it wasn't like just one day. I mean, yes, there was that feeling of wanting to do something a little bit more light than the emotion of singing songs, which feels sometimes very vulnerable and exposing. But there was there was a kind of organic shift, in the sense that I'd always chatted between my songs, and people had always laughed at some of the self-deprecating stories I told. So it'd always been in there in the back of my mind as maybe something I would do. And because I've always been a journalist, and when I was doing music, I also wrote about music and reviewed music for a number of magazines and newspapers, and that was a way of earning a little bit of extra income as well. But it was, it was really kind of rubbish income. Like, I wrote for magazines that would pay you sort of 20 quid, for a kind of 200, 300 word review. But it was great because you got in free, and you got to go to loads of gigs. So that was kind of the draw of it, really. And nowadays, of course, there are a ton of websites that would expect you to write for free, and just getting access to free music would be your payment. I mean, I don't agree with that, but obviously it's difficult when there are so many people who are really happy to do it for nothing. How do you sort of then argue against it? You can't tell them not to do it. But it's like, you kind of think, you're ruining it for everyone who used to get paid. Because now, website editors will just expect that they can get good people for no money. So, so complicated, isn't it? But I always knew that I wanted to write a book. So when the first show, Is Monogamy Dead, started spinning off into more serious thought and discussion and debate, because it's a really complex topic: monogamy, fidelity, cheating. Everyone's got an opinion. Polyamory. We were just starting to talk about, alternatives to our sort of normalized scripts about how we have relationships. So it started to lead to me writing some more serious articles, doing some slightly more serious talks, a TEDx talk, a Radio 4 forethought piece called A New Currency of Commitment. And so it led to all this other more serious stuff. And so I decided I wanted to write a book. And I found a literary agent, and after much pitching around, I found an indie publisher. I mean, I think, I was a slightly ahead of the curve with a book about monogamy, and I think I had meetings with big publishers, the sort of Little Brown and people like that. But we had an editor who wanted to publish it, but she fairly honestly said, I have to convince the blokes in suits, and they're going to be a bit scared of this. And she couldn't convince them. So we went with an indie, which I thought, well, maybe that suits me because I'm quite a grassrootsy performer. I, love performing in communities. I'm sort of known in the LGBT community. I like that sort of authenticity of not necessarily working with big corporate companies. But there were a lot of problems because this indie were in real financial difficulty and were making a ton of their staff redundant, and it was a really stressful time. And eventually, that indie got bought out by a major. But obviously, during that transition process, you're just not sure what's going on. You're kind of ringing your publisher, and the phone is just ringing out because there's basically nobody left in the office. So a lot of authors were not getting paid their royalties. We were getting phone calls from the bookseller magazine saying, is your publisher paying you? And we were like, we don't know what's going on. And so that was obviously a really stressful and difficult time. And so when that book had come out and I started doing a show about breakups, I made a very conscious decision to apply for some Arts Council funding for a new project called the Breakup Monologues, which at that time was going to be a sort of live, maybe a storytelling show more like the Vagina Monologues than the Breakup Monologues is actually now more of an actual chat show. But I thought initially it was going to be different people coming on and sort of telling a breakup story like that Vagina Monologues kind of format. And I kind of really wanted to try and get some funding to get this project off the ground. And I thought alongside that live show, we might record some of them for a podcast. Podcasting was still a bit new. I wasn't necessarily thinking of doing a regular podcast that I released every week, but I thought, yeah, we'll put some out and we'll have some blogs and people will write some pieces and it'll be a bit of a cross-platform project. In the end, of course, then I realized that podcasting was really taking off, and I started releasing more regular episodes with some absolutely awesome comedians, comedy friends, and some high profile names. We've had people like Ed Byrne and Lou Sanders, Shapiqul Sandy. Some really great people on. So it's been really exciting. But it was really born out of how do I make this body of work about love and relationships and all this research that I've ended up doing into something a bit more tangible. And in that Arts Council proposal that was largely based around a live show, I said in that the ultimate aim was to do a book. And so, that was the ultimate aim, was to get an agent and a publisher for the book. And I worked with Bloomsbury, who are obviously a much bigger publisher for the Breakup Monologues book. And largely speaking, that was a really great experience. But it's still, publishing is so tough. And in many ways, there are so many biases, again, that publishing is doing its best to have sort of diverse imprints that champion new voices or marginalized voices. But there's still an emphasis on many structures that favor writers with privilege and with rich, privileged networks of people who can maybe afford to buy their book on the first day that it comes out, when it's like, hardback, and it's obviously a lot more expensive than the paperback that eventually comes out and things like that. So I think there are a lot of things where they've not thought through how the structures of publishing would impact anybody who is from any kind of marginalized or working class background. I think there are efforts being made, but because publishing is largely, basically posh, white, straight people, they haven't quite all understood the complex intersection of challenges that might be faced by writers who are trying to create work in a really authentic way. And it's very much what I think it was the screenwriter of American Fiction, made this great Oscars speech where he said, instead of making this one movie for like however many $1 million, why don't you just make loads of smaller indie movies with people who are really passionate and can do something incredible with this smaller budget that's maybe like a tenth of, the crazy mega budget that's being splooged away by a load of celebs or whatever. I mean, yeah, we need blockbusters for sure. They're really entertaining. But it is annoying how, in all art forms, there's just this huge divide, isn't there, between the people who are getting paid crazy money and most of us who are just trying to make a living doing some really good work. And sometimes we are really compromised by the budget being available and how much we can do. I mean, I have so many people come up to me at my shows saying, "Oh my God, we've never heard of you before. We've never heard about your work, but this has totally made me able to be friends with my ex and communicate with my ex. It's made me feel less alone about how I feel in my relationship. It's stopped me from getting divorced, or it's helped empower me to have a divorce and feel okay about it." And those kind of feelings that people have gone away with, you can't really put a price on that. But in a way, I do need publishers and gatekeepers to put a price on it and realize that it really has some value because it is reaching people and touching them. And, I just hope that I can continue to write. But for many of us, at a sort of mid kind of level where we are professional artists, creatives, writers, but, it's always a bit hand to mouth. There is always that question, are people going to keep investing in my work? Am I going to be able to carry on? And I'm in the difficult position at the moment, which many of my author friends are, and we don't like to talk about it, but I think we do need to be honest about it, where I've sold thousands and thousands of copies of my book, but I haven't quite earned my advances back yet, which wasn't like a crazy amount, especially after my agent had taken her percentage as well, which is absolutely right. Agents should get a percentage. They help you get a publisher, so they're really important. But yeah, it's kind of, we feel like this kind of shameful thing that like, oh my God, I haven't earned my advance back yet. And so I still got a few hundred copies to sell before that kind of, or because they pay you by this really horrible complex equation where you literally get barely anything per book that you sell. And it sort of decreases depending on whether people like Amazon discount your book and, all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And what people don't know as well is that authors can buy copies of their own book at discounted price and sell those. And I often do that at my more sort of indie gigs and festivals where I'm in some far-flung queer tent or science tent that's not in the main bookshop where the posh white authors kind of all sit, posh white straight authors or whatever. I mean, I am white, but I'm marginalised in other ways because I'm queer. And I'm always seen as a bit weird and neurodiverse or whatever. So I'm never sort of often in the big kind of posh main tent at literary festivals and stuff. They'll say, "Oh, you can do this kind of fringe free event." And I'm like, but why? I've been on Radio 4. I've toured the world. I can do something really good, I promise. But but what happens is when you buy your own copies and you sell those and you can maybe make a little bit more profit on them, they do not count towards your official royalties. And when publishers who are going to be maybe publishing your next book look up your sales, they don't see any of the copies that you've been grafting away selling yourself when you've been selling those copies independently. And so that may determine what you get paid for your next book. So all of these things are not really fully explained to authors when they first sign their publishing contract and when you first start out. But you learn as you go and you realize, gosh, it's really complicated. And in many ways, it does sort of make it more challenging to authors who are a bit more on the fringes, a bit more grassrootsy, who've basically grown up with that DNA of a sort of, DIY ethic. Yeah.
And in terms of sales of the book, then, do you have a kind of rough idea of the split of like how many you sell yourself versus, the long tail of Amazon and bookshops and everything else?
Yeah, I think it's a real split. I mean, to be honest, but yeah, I mean, I've definitely sold a good few thousand on Amazon, and of course on Amazon people can get the Kindle and the audiobook versions as well, which I narrated, and you do get paid a fee to narrate your audiobook as well. So that was good. That was quite a strange and fun a couple of days doing that. Very intense. And yeah, I seem to get more money when people like download the Kindle or the audiobook, because it's very hard to tell exactly what you're going to get from physical sales of a book, because yeah, there's so many different discounts that are made, and yeah, that's much more complex. Whereas I know in a much more fixed and concrete way what I get per Kindle sale or audiobook sale. But I think because not a lot of people have a Kindle, you don't typically sell as many kind of Kindle versions as kind of paperbacks and hardbacks. But it's been nice to see the audiobook doing quite well in the charts, particularly after I've been on radio shows. Like I was on Graham Norton's radio show when the paperback first came out, and the audiobook really soared up the charts then. So that was really, really nice to see, because when you're sitting there in a room narrating it, you just think, I hope somebody listens to this version. But yeah, I've definitely sold hundreds and hundreds sort of at gigs on my own. It's, it is a fraction of probably what I've actually sold through Amazon and Waterstones and the bigger retailers and at big festivals where they've got official bookshops. But still, it is, it does kind of slightly skew the figures as well. If you've got, even 500 or 1,000 copies that you've sold directly yourself to audiences that don't show up on your data, and you don't get paid royalties on. So it's all of these things that until you're deep in the thick of a book campaign and getting out there promoting it, and then seeing how the sort of figures work out, that you start to understand how the economics, the business side of it all works.
So on the podcast itself, it's interesting. You talking that your initial idea was, like you said, more of a monologue, but an awful lot of the time you have multiple guests. Do you think that helps people, and often live as well? Do you think that helps people be a bit more open about what they say? So if it was just you with someone, then they'd be a bit more closed. But when it's a group, do they feel safer in being a bit more honest?
Yeah, I love the fact that we have just really free-flowing conversations on the podcast. And if anyone hasn't listened to the Breakup Monologues before and they want a really fun one to go in on for their first taste of it, I'd recommend the episode from Brighton Fringe with Zoe Lyons and Hal Cruttenden and my broadcasting friend, BB Lynch, because the three of them just bring something so different each. And the flirting that ends up happening between my good pal BB and Hal Cruttenden is brilliant. They basically get together and have a marriage and a divorce all sort of live in front of the audience as part of the show. So please do go and listen to that one, and do leave us a rating on your preferred podcast platform, which you must do for this podcast for Making Creativity Pay as well, because all those ratings really help your visibility. And again, I'm always telling friends or readers who get in touch with me and say, oh, I loved your book. It really helped me. I really laughed and cried. And I said, well, please, will you leave a review or a rating on Amazon? Because it just helps. And people, I think, don't realize until you tell them how much those things actually help other people to then see your podcast or see your book and know it exists. They don't realize that it's so important for them to do that thing that only takes a minute, but it really, really makes a difference and helps.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guilty of that. Sometimes you do the podcast and you kind of think, oh God, sometimes it's a struggle. It's not the hardest thing in the world, but about getting them out. And then someone will send you a message and you think, oh, that's fantastic. But I don't do that enough myself to podcasts I listen to. I should do, to say, hey, love the episode. It's a small thing, but yeah, it really does make a difference.
Yeah.
So what's your current plans now? Because I think the last episode of Breakup Monologues was the turn of the year. Is it just a pause, or is there something else now? I mean, what are your kind of future plans?
It is just a pause because I've been writing a novel, which is set on the London comedy circuit. And I have very excitingly received Arts Council Developing Your Creative Practice funding for that transition from writing nonfiction into writing fiction. And so that is to pay me a little bit for my time, which is such an incredible relief to have that money. I was so relieved to get it. and also pay for some mentoring and help from a couple of friends who are brilliant fiction writers. So yeah, I hope that, maybe we can get a publisher interested maybe towards the end of this year, and then it would come out, I don't know, who knows, towards the end of 2025, perhaps. I mean, publishing is slow, so that might be an ambitious schedule, but I would hope that might be possible still. The Breakup Monologues podcast will be back towards the end of the year. I'm starting to book in live festivals and live events and live recordings. Jersey Festival of Words are going to be hosting one of those in September, and one or two other things that I'm firming up at the moment. And yeah, if there's any venues out there that want to host a live recording of the Breakup Monologues, get in touch.
Yeah. And so do you find that, that kind of works well on a logistics point of view, that if you've got you then don't have to worry so much about a venue or kind of making sure guests are, if it's an actual physical thing rather than, like this where it's virtual, you've got a thing, you've got a place, a lot of the logistics are then sorted out and it kind of becomes a bit easier.
Well, in many ways it does. I mean, I just love the feel of a live podcast because of the audience laughter. I just think it really adds something. So I just love that. Also, it gives you an income stream from ticket revenue, or some of the festivals that have booked the podcast, bigger festivals especially, will pay a fee, which is lovely, because then you can pay your guests something, or some of them even pay your guests as well separately, which is absolutely brilliant. And yeah, I think that just works incredibly well. But the downside with it is obviously finding guest who's available at that particular time on that particular date in that particular location. Yeah. So, sometimes if, like last year, I took the podcast on a bit of a mini tour and we went to Norwich Arts Centre, and I knew that, there were a couple of brilliant artists there that I really wanted to speak to, Grace Petrie and her partner, Molly Naylor. And I just thought they would make the most wonderful podcast episode. And fortunately, they were available. In fact, I think I changed my date with the venue to get them. So sometimes it's more artist-led than venue-led, and you've got this complicated negotiation that goes on in that sense. Whereas if you're just going to chat to someone over Zoom, it's just like, well, when are you free? Great. And that bit is simpler, but I do think there's a joy in hosting it live.
Thanks for listening. There's more details in the show notes about where you can find out more about Rosie and the Breakup Monologues. If you enjoyed this, check out some of our previous episodes where we speak to people from a variety of areas, including comedians about their fringe experiences, as well as musicians and authors discussing how they try to make creativity pay.